Chapter 5. There was no way Scott could go back to bed after all the excitement. Instead, he used his phone as a flashlight and made his way to the breaker box in the garage. There, his suspicions were confirmed. All the breakers had tripped. He reset them and returned to his room, where he was relieved to find his computer had not been turned into a molten lump as he had feared. It powered up, ran a self-diagnostic for the unexpected shutdown, and then booted up as though nothing had even happened. He was sure to disconnect the loop beforehand, of course, at least until he had a better understanding of what had occurred. He wasn't sure exactly how he would find out, was fairly certain that Googling, "Why did I start hearing voices after I hooked up a Nazi relic to my computer?" would probably alert someone, either a government goon or the intake doctor of the local loony bin. Fortunately, the only knock at his door came from his mother, when she frantically stuck her head in to tell him she was headed to the airport. She was late for her flight because the power had apparently blinked sometime overnight, and she had awoken to a flashing alarm clock. She quickly kissed him goodbye and then went to bid Walter farewell. Scott sat at his desk for a very long time, staring at the screen and studying the available data. After an hour, he leaned back and rubbed his eyes. All he knew for certain was, number 1, the gold loop worked. But, number 2, he still had no clue as to what it did. Other than, number 3, it glowed and made him hear strange voices. And number 4, it required more power than what his home or computer could safely supply. He continued to mull these facets over for a very long time, carefully considering each one. Finally, he leaned back in his chair and came to the only rational and reasonable conclusion he could. He needed more power. Unlike the sprawling campuses of nearby George Washington University and Georgetown University, the Heinlein College of Science and Technology, HCST for short, was still a budding educational facility that occupied only a single building. It was a large one, with 3 stories of floor-to-ceiling glass windows, and was surrounded by a cramped parking lot dotted with shrubs. The building had once been office and retail space, but the smattering of tanning salons, mental health counselors, and young lawyers fresh from the bar exam had all been given the boot once the property owners learned they could make more money by leasing the whole thing to the college. For Scott, HCST was ideal because it not only offered the undergraduate degree in computer science he wanted, but it was far less expensive than other schools. They had all frowned at his ACT scores anyway, and certainly weren't very charitable with the scholarships. Although an extremely bright kid, his academic habits had been less than stellar, and the more prestigious institutions hadn't exactly flooded his mailbox with offers. HCST may not have carried the name recognition of the neighboring universities, but who really cared? All he needed was a signed and sealed piece of paper to hang on his wall. Then he could find some entry-level position with a big tech company, start building his resume, and maybe even get in on some game design somewhere. That was the plan, anyway. The thought of spending the rest of his life getting paid to play video games would be an absolute dream come true. As an added bonus, the campus was fairly close to home, so he could ride his scooter. It was a black single-seater with assorted Rock Band stickers covering the larger scratches. He coasted it to a stop at the spaces reserved for bicycles and killed the puttering engine. His earbuds were blasting a song by Panic at the Disco that could be heard from a few feet away. Despite the intense DC heat, he wore jeans, tennis shoes, his favorite Captain America t-shirt with a shield printed on the front, and a heavy black backpack that hung low between his shoulders. He chained his scooter to the bike rack, wiped the sweat from his face, and then went inside into the blessed air conditioning. The place was mostly deserted, with only one or two faculty members wandering the halls and the occasional student sprawled out in a chair, texting, tweeting, or otherwise engaged with their cell phone. The school year was coming to a close, and most of the student body had already finished with their final exams. Scott himself had only one more to go, and if not for the curious object in his backpack, wouldn't have even bothered coming in until he just had to. He took the elevator to the third floor, which was dedicated to the majority of the computer classes. Stepping out, he found this, too, was practically deserted. He walked down the hall until he came to room number 398, the largest of the computer labs. He held up his student ID card to the RF scanner and heard the door latch click. One flaw the college had encountered shortly after opening was with non-students entering the building and using the computers in all sorts of inappropriate manners. The infractions ran the gamut, from downloading pirated movies and illegal music to watching porn. The faculty quickly remedied the situation by having locks installed that would only open with valid RF-encoded cards, which ensured that only registered students and teachers could watch pirated movies, download illegal music, and watch porn. There were, of course, firewalls and other preventative measures to curtail such illicit activities, but since most of the scholars were all computer geeks, these were circumvented easily enough. Scott stepped inside the large computer room and was a little dismayed to find a handful of other students already there. He counted 6 in all scattered about the 5 rows of tables that housed the 50 computers. He had to frown. The place was usually quite popular during the school year, with its high-speed internet and top-of-the-line machines, but he didn't think anyone would be there so close to the end of the semester, and especially not so early in the morning. He recognized a few of the faces, but, being such an introvert, couldn't put any names to them. None of them looked up when he entered, each so engrossed in their own business. An attractive girl with long blonde hair was checking her Snapchat. An athletic Hispanic young man was checking baseball stats. A young black male had headphones on and was streaming online music. 2 other boys were playing online games. One overweight youth, who really didn't even look old enough to be in college in the first place, was actually studying. Who studies on a Saturday? Scott thought. He sighed. Okay, so he had more company than he wanted. But they were here first, and there really wasn't much he could do about it anyway. For a brief moment, he was tempted to make some announcement about the computers going down for maintenance, but since that would require him to actually speak to a group of strangers, he quickly nixed the idea. He would just have to work around them and hope they would eventually leave on their own. He looked around for the one person who was supposed to be there, but saw no indication that he had yet arrived. He took out his phone and sent Michael a text. "Where are you?" A few moments later, he received his reply. "If you're not a hot brunette in a string bikini, go away. Sleeping." Scott scoffed. How could he be sleeping when there was something so incredibly awesome Scott needed to show him? He quickly texted back. "Get your ass over here. You have to see this." A few more moments went by, and when he got no reply, he added, "Get here now, or I send your mom a screenshot of your Tinder profile." A moment later, his phone dinged. "K, you asshat, OMW." Scott had to laugh. Michael had just said, "Okay, you asshat, I'm on my way." Scott spent the next half hour working at the computer furthest away from the other students. He had his earbuds in and cranked up his MP3 player so he could avoid having to talk with anyone. Fortunately, the others were so engrossed in their affairs that they didn't seem to notice, or care, that he was so casually dismantling one of the school's machines. He had little concern with any faculty dropping in. They were all much too busy grading final exams and making summer plans. When the door finally opened, Scott looked up to see Michael step in. His brown hair was a mess, and he looked as though he had literally just crawled out of bed. He had thrown on jeans and a wrinkled black t-shirt imprinted with a logo from an old Pink Floyd album. He looked around until he spotted Scott in the back, waving him over. "Okay, you douche nugget," Michael yawned as he approached. "This had better involve food, money, or nudity." "None of the above," Scott laughed, carefully soldering a wire inside the open tower. Michael cocked his head, puzzled at the sight of Scott so nonchalantly vandalizing school property. His eyes drifted to the ribbon cord in his hand and followed it until he saw the gold loop sitting on the table. Scott grinned when he saw Michael's perplexed reaction. "That's why I called you," Scott said. "Found it in a box of my grandfather's war stuff." "Great grandfather," Michael corrected. He cocked an eyebrow as he studied the loop. "War stuff? You're not about to go all Al-Qaeda on the school, are you?" "No. I'm just going to borrow their processing power for a bit. It about fried mine when I hooked it up last night." Now it was Michael's turn to laugh. "So you bring it here to fry the school's computers instead. Nice." He bent over to examine the loop more closely, but even after studying it for several moments, finally had to admit defeat. "Okay, I give up. What is it?" Scott only shrugged. "Don't know. Once I finally got it to sync up, it started putting off this really weird blue glow." Michael looked at him, clearly disappointed. "Congratulations, bruh. You made a lamp. Nikola Tesla would be proud." "No, man," Scott said, then looked around to make sure he wouldn't be overheard. "I think I also heard a voice." Michael raised an eyebrow and looked at Scott suspiciously, trying to determine if he was being serious or was just trolling him. Then he grinned. "Let me guess. It spoke parcel tongue and told you to kill Mrs. Norris." "I know, right?" Scott said, realizing how it sounded. "I don't know. Maybe I was still half asleep and dreaming." "What did it say?" "No clue," Scott admitted. "It wasn't even English." "Of course," Michael said. "It had to be Martian." "Very funny, smartass. Help me with this and you'll see for yourself." Michael stared at him, half amused and half apprehensive. "Let me get this straight. You find your great-grandfather's old war relic, hook it up and give it juice. It turns blue and starts talking to you before it fries your computer, so your brilliant solution is to bring it to school?" Scott shrugged and nodded. "Yeah, pretty much. I rewrote the code so it will distribute the processing loads. If a single system starts to get overtaxed like mine did, it will transfer some of the routines to another computer to help out." "Oh, even better," Michael chuckled. "You created a virus." Scott considered it a moment, then shrugged. "It's not really a virus. I mean, it's not like I'm out to swipe anyone's credit card numbers or hack their nudes or anything. Besides, it's science, right? And this is school. What better place to study science than in a classroom?" Michael mulled it over for a moment. What Scott was proposing sounded completely irresponsible, maybe even dangerous. To get caught would mean getting into serious trouble, possibly even expelled. And he really couldn't even explain why they were doing it, other than having the hopes of hearing a strange voice from a mysterious glowing loop. He thought about it a few moments more, then finally nodded. "Sure, bruh. Count me in." They spent the next hour wiring and soldering components, and another downloading the software from Scott's thumb drive and running minor tweaks on the program. Michael pointed out a few improvements in the coding and made a few other suggestions that Scott readily implemented. After isolating and correcting all the bumps, they finally found themselves staring at a blinking cursor poised over an execute command. "Ready?" Scott asked. He was a tad apprehensive at repeating the bizarre events of the previous night, but mostly he was excited. "Go for it," Michael said. Scott placed his hand on the mouse, then warily looked around the room at the other students. None of them had left as he'd hoped, and he wondered what they would think when the blue light began to shine. Each was so engrossed in their own menial tasks that he figured they probably wouldn't even notice. He looked back at Michael and grinned. Then he clicked the left button. The computer screen quickly filled with cascading numbers as the program went to work. The boys eagerly looked over to the loop, but were disappointed when it only sat idle. They watched it for a full minute, then 2. There was no movement, no glowing, and certainly no strange voices. "Bruh," Michael said. "Are you sure you weren't smoking a Scooby-Dooby when you heard those alien voices?" Scott ignored him and began to check the wiring, thinking he must have just overlooked something. He was fumbling with the connections when a sound suddenly erupted from the table, making him jump back. But the sound wasn't coming from the loop. It was music, a song called "Stressed Out" by 21 Pilots that Scott used as his ringtone. He had neglected to place his phone on silent mode, and it was ringing. He quickly grabbed it and silenced it, giving an apologetic look to all the other students who were looking at him to see what the racket was. Michael chuckled under his breath and called him a loser. Scott glanced at the cell phone to see who was calling and groaned when he saw Walter would like to video chat on the display. He briefly considered ignoring the call, but his mind conjured an image of the old man lying on the floor, suffering a heart attack and trying to call for help. Scott would have to explain to his mother why he had let Walter die in their living room. He sighed and pressed the accept button, and Walter's smiling face appeared on the screen. "Hey, sport," Walter greeted, a little too cheerfully for Scott's liking. He reminded him of a television host or a timeshare salesman. So much for the heart attack. "Hello, Walter," Scott grumbled. "Where are you, bud? I was just about to cook some breakfast. Eggs, bacon, pancakes. Sound good?" Scott was about to reply when Michael suddenly nudged him in the ribs with his elbow. Scott only waved him off. "Sounds great, Walter. Knock yourself out, but I'm in school right now, so rain check." Walter squinted at the screen and frowned upon seeing Scott was indeed at the school. "Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you were about finished with school." "I am," Scott said, but before he could continue, Michael jabbed him in the ribs again, much harder this time. Scott clutched his side and turned to glare at him. "Cut it out, you fuzz-knuckle, that hurt!" Michael didn't say anything. Instead, only sat staring wide-eyed at the table. Scott followed his gaze and was surprised to see the loop had slowly begun to rotate. "Hey, Walter, I gotta go." Walter looked disappointed but nodded. "Okay, buddy. Call me when you're about to head back. I'll have lunch ready for you." Scott didn't reply, too transfixed as the gold loop began to revolve. He was about to hang up when he suddenly realized that Walter could finally answer the question he'd been wondering about all night. "Hey, Walter, where'd this loop come from anyway?" Walter only looked puzzled. What loop?" The loop continued to spin, slowly gaining speed. "The gold loop," Scott said. "Where'd it come from?" Walter looked lost, having no idea what Scott was talking about. "What gold loop?" Scott turned the phone so the camera faced the table. The picture blurred and sharpened as it tried to focus in on the moving object. When it finally did, Walter was even more confused. It was a gold loop, all right, one that even seemed vaguely familiar. But the only gold loop he ever recalled seeing was from long ago. The one from... Walter's eyes went wide and his face paled. No, it couldn't be. Scott, he said, barely above a whisper. Where did you get that? Scott didn't answer right away, his attention squarely on the spinning loop. It was picking up speed, turning faster and faster until it was just a blur. Inside, a tiny blue plasma field began to form, and both he and Michael leaned forward in awe. Never mind, Walter, Scott said. I need to record this. Scott, Walter said, now deeply alarmed. Where did you get that? In your box of war stuff. Catch you later. Scott hit the end button, and Walter's image abruptly disappeared from the screen. He quickly switched the phone over to camera mode and began to record video. He grinned over at Michael as if to say, See, I told you so. The boys watched the loop in amazement as the blue plasma field slowly began to expand until it was the size of a softball. Scott and Michael both began to feel a tingling sensation, as though a few hundred ants were marching over their faces. The boys looked at each other nervously, then scooted their chairs back a bit. Michael joked, You wouldn't happen to have a Geiger counter handy, would you? Suddenly, the computer screen in front of Scott began to flash a notification, informing him that it was reallocating resources. Almost immediately, the computer adjacent to it suddenly powered up from sleep mode. A download progress bar appeared on the screen and began to climb from 0 until it rapidly reached 100%. Its screen became a cascade of numbers as it, too, began to run Scott's program. It worked, Scott said, a little too loudly, causing a few of the students to glance over again to see what the excitement was. Scott's phone suddenly began to blare 21 Pilots again. He cursed, not only because he knew Walter was calling, but because the old man had interrupted his video recording. He jabbed the ignore button and quickly fumbled with the camera to return it to video mode. When he finally got it turned back on and pointing at the loop, he was shocked to find the plasma field had doubled in size. His smile began to fade. Do you smell that? Michael asked, getting a whiff of bitter ozone. Smells like Megatron's toilet. He covered his nose and scooted even further back until his chair hit the wall. He stared at the loop a moment more before adding, I'm not hearing any voices, bruh. Scott had to admit that he didn't either, but only shook his head and continued to record. Suddenly, the computer began to flash the reallocating resources message again, and Scott was surprised when a third computer awoke. It quickly downloaded the program and likewise began running the numbers. Almost instantly, the blue plasma field doubled in size again and was now larger than the loop itself. Scott and Michael exchanged concerned glances. Okay, Cat, Michael said apprehensively. If that thing gets any bigger, I vote for hitting the kill switch. Scott nodded in agreement, but found himself questioning whether or not he had even had the forethought to put one in. Oops, he thought. Minor oversight number 1. Even pulling the plug would now mean having to pull 3 or more, depending on how many computers woke up. Suddenly, the virus idea didn't seem like such a good one after all. He was mulling it over when he was suddenly startled by a voice. Whoa, that's awesome! It hadn't come from the loop, however, but instead from directly beside him. Scott and Michael both turned, surprised to see the overweight boy who'd been studying a few tables over. He was now standing by theirs, a large blue backpack hefted over his shoulder, and watching the loop intently. His eyes were wide, the pulsating blue field reflecting off the thick lenses of his glasses. He leaned forward for a better look and stared in amazement. What is this thing? He asked. Just an experiment, Scott answered, not quite lying, but certainly not caring for any spectators. He was even more irked when the kid reached out a hand as though he were going to touch it. Scott was about to tell him not to do that when, much to everyone's surprise, the blue plasma suddenly sprouted a long, finger-like tendril. It drifted outward as though reaching back toward the boy. He quickly retracted his hand, and the tendril slowly withdrew, receding like the tentacle of an octopus beneath a rock. "Holy feces," the boy muttered. He looked like a surprised child who'd gone to pet a fluffy dog, only to have it nip at his hand. Scott stared warily at the blue field, trying to work out what had just happened. The plasma core had acted just like its novelty counterpart by being attracted to the boy's body, which basically served as a discharge path due to its conductive properties. He had to wonder what the consequences of actual physical contact would be. An electric shock? A nasty burn? Death? He couldn't know for sure, but wasn't exactly itching to stick a finger in and find out. He was still mulling it over when the computer beeped, alerting that it had once again decided the need to reallocate resources. To his surprise, the warning sounded again just a moment later, and yet again a moment after that. He looked down the row of computers and, to his horror, saw that each machine was waking up and downloading the program. It wasn't just the ones on his row, either. All around the room, the students looked puzzled as their computers abruptly halted their current activities and began to download and run Scott's program. The students looked around in frustration until they all spotted the bright blue glow in the back of the room. Scott and Michael stood up, both looking like they were ready to bolt. "Okay," Michael said, his voice filled with genuine fear. "I think it may be time to unplug Frankenstein." Scott heartily agreed and quickly reached over to tap the escape key. The program didn't stop, however, so he tapped it again. Still no response. He tried pressing Alt-Control-Delete to bring up the task manager, but only received a program not responding error. The loop, meanwhile, continued to whirl, the plasma field glowing a bright blue. It was different now, Scott noticed, seemingly denser. Adding to his dismay, the other students all came over and began to gather around the table to gape at the unusual sight. Like bugs to a zapper, he thought. "What is that?" the black young man asked. "Whoa, now that's cool," said a white male in a thick southern drawl. "It's pretty," said the girl. "What is it?" Scott only continued to frantically mash the buttons on the keyboard. He was about to press and hold the power button on the tower for a hard reboot when suddenly all the monitors around the room began to flash in unison, looking like some strobe light in a horror movie. Scott looked around in a panic, suddenly realizing that the program now had control of 50 computers, all tied together and feeding the beast. The plasma field had grown the deepest blue yet, almost looking as though it were collecting enough energy to... Oh, crud. "Scott?" Michael asked, terrified. Scott reached around to the back of the computer, ready to yank whatever wires he needed to, when suddenly a singular message began to flash on all the computer screens. Executing. 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 Scott looked back to the plasma field, just in time to see it explode in a brilliant flash of blue light that engulfed them all.